Bonjour, good afternoon, good morning. It all depends on where people are coming from. So we are pleased to say that we might have guests who are attending from various parts of the country and possibly internationally. Bonjour, je m'appelle Bilkis Vissandjée. Je suis professeure titulaire à la Faculté des sciences infirmières à l'Université de Montréal, ainsi qu'à l'École de santé publique de l'Université de Montréal et au Centre de recherche en santé publique de l'Université de Montréal et du CIUS Centre-Sud de l'île de Montréal. C'est vraiment un grand plaisir de pouvoir vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour un événement un peu unique, un peu différent pour le CReSP. Et comme on aime innover, alors c'est toujours agréable d'avoir des invités. Donc, je suis ravie aujourd'hui de vous accueillir dans une conversation qui se tiendra en anglais, mais que professeur Edwards est tout à fait ouvert à ce qu'on ait des questions en français. Et ensuite, il nous fera plaisir de traduire, mais de façon générale, je pense que les collègues, les étudiants qui se branchent sont tout à fait en mesure de poser également des questions en anglais. Alors, sans plus tarder, il est presque 12h03 pour ne pas perdre trop le temps précieux pour pouvoir échanger. Je vous présente aujourd'hui professeur Dr. Nancy Edwards, qui est également fellow de l'Académie canadienne des sciences de la santé, qui est professeur distingué et professeur émérite à l'École des sciences infirmières de l'Université d'Ottawa. Elle est bien sûr infirmière depuis de quelques années, des études supérieures en épidémio et a fait un peu le tout puisqu'elle a aussi fait l'expérience d'études chez nous au Québec à l'Université McGill. Alors, elle travaille notamment au niveau de la santé publique et de la population, la santé mondiale qui donc caractérise la majeure partie de sa carrière, notamment en ce qui concerne le renforcement des capacités, la prestation de programmes en santé maternelle et infantile, la réduction des inégalités en matière de santé et surtout de voir à l'implantation de la recherche et des défis de sa mise en œuvre. Alors, Nancy, depuis fort longtemps, est un exemple d'une mentor pour la nombreuse génération des chercheurs qui peut-être sont présents aujourd'hui, mais par sa contribution extraordinaire à titre d'abord pour tous ses travaux qu'elle a fait à travers différents continents, ses réflexions dans les orientations stratégiques pour la santé mondiale lorsqu'elle était directrice scientifique de l'Institut pour la santé des populations et la santé publique aux instituts de recherche en santé du Canada. Alors aujourd'hui, on aura le plaisir de l'entendre parler de son volume, de son expérience de vie à travers lesquelles elle nous parle un peu de diverses racines fondamentales d'apprentissage en santé mondiale par le biais de ses expériences au Sierra Leone, en Afrique de l'Ouest, où elle a travaillé pendant fort longtemps comme infirmière en santé populationnelle et où elle a évalué de nombreux programmes pendant au moins 5 ans. Alors voilà, professeur Edwards, aujourd'hui, nous partage ses expériences dans son livre Not One, Not Even One, a Memoir of Life-altering Experiences in Sierra Leone, West Africa. Professor Edwards, it's such a pleasure to have you here today. I could not make it any shorter, but I could have made it longer. So I would like to start by congratulating you on this book, and also to thank you for accepting our invitation to share your experiences today. It's unique for us, and especially because you sort of represent an epitome of an example for some of us who know you for a long time and the young generation. So I'm pleased to tell you that we do have a diversity of members who are listening to us today. And so one of my first questions is always like this, why? So what can you share with us that was the, the light, the sparkle that made you write these memoirs?
Well, thank you very much, Bilkis, and really I'm humbled by your introduction. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici avec vous. And that's the end of my French, I'm afraid. But yes, what led me to write the memoir? Well, I guess it had been in the back of my mind for some time. About 10, 15 years ago, I decided I better write a few short stories about some of my experiences in Sierra Leone for my family and close friends. They had always told me that they didn't know much really about what my work had involved. So I did that, and then I put those aside and continued with my academic writing. But I felt that there was something there perhaps, and maybe I could turn it into a memoir. And after I retired, and then of course COVID came along, which gave all of us time we didn't know what to do with, it seemed the right thing to do. And I've really captured both why I have titled the memoir what I have, as well as the impetus for it in a poem that I wrote, which appears at the beginning of the memoir. So perhaps I'll start by reading that, and it will give you a bit
that would be lovely. I was going to ask you that.
Yeah, it will give you a bit of context too for the villages where I worked. I worked with the Mende people, which is the second largest ethnic group in Sierra Leone. An African Mende village where Ngewo, God, gives and takes. Rainforest provides and threatens. Farming feeds and starves. Pecan children bring lifetimes of promise or sorrow, and childbearing is the lifeline to social security. Nurses, midwives, dispensers, and doctors in barely accessible clinics, health centers, and hospitals promise treatment and services that frighten and cost and displace. Dislocating villagers from Maori men, traditional birth attendants, and ancestors who were trusted to heal and protect and appease. Nurses squat on cane stools, asking women about reproductive histories, for precise numbers, for robust indicators, for efficient measures of public health impact. Standard questions cut through women's stories to the nub of births and deaths and causes and dates and ages. An elder edges forward. Deep wrinkles, gnarled fingers, a halting gait. Mama is outside our bandwidth of childbearing years. Propelled by determination, resolute for an interview, she will add her history to public health records. Mama sits, bold and deliberate, eye to eye with this Pumwi, myself, foreigner. Translation begins. Mama, how many pregnancies? 12. Mama, how many were born alive? Her voice catches. 7. My inquiry softens. Mama, how many lived to the age of 5? Tears well, shoulders slump, memories flood. None, she whispers. Not one child lives, not even one. Turning away, she chants, Ide to God. It is up to God, wrapping herself in fatalism, quelling grief. My words can't console, my words can't express. My words can't talk. Her story renders my words empty and superfluous. In a mode of silence, we clutch hands and hearts, women bridging and feeling and connecting across our cultural divide. Her shared story, her only memory keeper of lost unborns and newborns. Mama's imparted narrative of losses and sorrow and heartbreak and grief and fatalism now seared deep within me. Decades since this encounter, I am beholden to this courageous Mende woman to amplify her story through worldly connections, to impart the despair of her losses, to bolster access to safe care, to prevent tragic scenarios of not one, not even one. So I think that answers your question. I guess that really what drove me.
It gives you goosebumps every time you read, every time you sort of focus and concentrate on what constitutes privilege.
Yes.
And what are the determinants that you have so often shared with us, as a professor and as a researcher, in terms of the determinants of vulnerability. And what you're citing here is exactly what we discuss in our public health sort of seminars about how to identify not only one, but the intersections of them. And that brings me to just listening to you, Nancy. I see you, at the international conferences, the Canadian Global Health Conference and the Canadian Society of International Health, and sort of exposing research seminars and research data in such a rigorous, eloquent way. So how did you sort of transition, or did you transition, or do you sort of do a bit of both in terms of this intensely emotional encounters that you're saying so well? And I can feel in your voice the emotions, and at the same time writing about research protocols and evaluating research protocols. So how do you do that? And is that something that you want to talk to students about? And by the way, students and colleagues who are on board or today, thank you for being there. And if anyone has any questions, please just raise the hand. This is a conversation, and we would love to hear from you. I'm just starting the conversation, but I would love to hear questions from colleagues who are here attending to this conversation. So what is the magic, Nancy?
Well, I guess it will be up to the reader to decide whether or not I have some magic. But it was quite a transition. I mean, as you know, writing academic protocols and academic papers, you are told not to write in first person, you write in third person. You do not use the words I, me, myself. So even that was a big transition for me. But I think you put your finger on probably what was the hardest. And that was all of the emotion and the challenges and the unfinished business and so on of the work that I really had to grapple with in new ways as I wrote the memoir. It took me many efforts at writing to sort out even what I felt comfortable disclosing, because as you get into the emotion of it, of course, it's much more personal than anything I had written academically. But I felt that that was really important. And it meant for me coming to terms with some of the choices I made and some of the approaches that we took with our primary healthcare program. I did join up with a writing group at our local public library. And for those who are interested in other kinds of writing, I found that very useful because people were writing in all kinds of genre. There was poets and people, another person writing a memoir, flash fiction, and so on. But they, first of all, didn't know anything about the context. So they often asked me important questions that helped me sort out what I needed to describe for the reader about the situation. But they also kept saying, so where are you in that story? And what about you? And what did you think? And what did you feel? And what did you sense? And what did you experience? What did you smell? All of these sorts of things that helped me add I think the level of description and detail that's important, and that help it come alive for the reader. So it really was a journey. And in that journey, sorting out what was okay for me to disclose, what I was comfortable disclosing personally, but also what I felt I should and should not disclose as a cultural outsider. I'm not a Mende woman. I'm not a Sierra Leonean. And there are things that I learned, some quite superficially while I was in the country about the culture that I felt were not proper for me to talk about. So those are probably some of the hardest decisions to make as I wrote the memoir. I hope I got it right.
It's fascinating what you're saying, because it's as you recount your experiences and I just sort of we're thrown in today's world where we are thinking of the complexities of reflexive practice, encouraging when we talk about global health, when we talk about regular sort of encounter, as someone who's done practice in nursing for the longest time, questioning ourselves, has been one of the 101 lesson, number one lesson that we've had, in order not to judge. And I find it interesting, when you talk about this reflexive practice, this cultural questioning of oneself, and where when we talk about global health, and we have mostly colleagues and students who are in global health here with us, where do we draw the line, in terms of being exposed to various determinants of inequalities? And, we always say, well, I cannot use the power of my privilege, but I would like to contribute, I would like to share, and I would like to be very humble in what I can learn and share. How do we reconcile the fact that, we will be outsiders given that our posture, our position right now, and the contribution, talking to this person who lost, every single one of her child. And I find that really nice, the way you title your book, Not One, Not Even One. Like, as the story builds, we sort of want to know what it is about. Mm-hmm. And so how do you sort of reconcile, the learnings of what constitute structural inequities that we learn and what you lived when you were in Sierra Leone, and what should our next generation learn about that? But they want to contribute. We have a lot of trainees who are listening to us today.
Well, I think reflexive practice is absolutely critical. And having been educated as a nurse, I think I had some of those skills going in, which was very helpful to me. But I think constantly learning and being open to learning and trying to sort out what your perspective is as a way, and understanding yourself more as a way of understanding other people more. And we need to bring our common humanity to the situation. We didn't even talk about or didn't label determinants of health with that label when I did my undergraduate training. And we talked about health inequalities, but not health inequities. So I think part of what I learned in Sierra Leone was what structural determinants of health are, even though we didn't have that language, and how deeply rooted they are. So basic services that I just took for granted in Canada. Everybody went to school until they were 16 years of age. Everybody had access to free schooling. There were trained professionals in our hospitals. There was a road infrastructure that we could rely on. All of this sort of thing was kind of blown to bits when I worked upcountry in Sierra Leone and saw the circumstances. So I started to understand more about those structural determinants. And I think over the years, I've really come to understand that the education of girls and women is particularly a profound structural determinant of health. I also saw and really started to understand for the first time the impact of colonialism. I didn't have that knowledge of my own country with Indigenous peoples, but certainly saw it in spades in Sierra Leone. The country had not been a full colony of Britain throughout the British presence there. Rather, the Brits had identified the area around Freetown, the capital, as the protectorate. And so that's where they put most of the infrastructure. There were great schools, there was good roads and so on there. But as soon as you went up country, it was like you were in another world. So just getting at and trying to understand those roots of colonialism, I think, was critical. And of course, that related then to who controlled the economic resources. Sierra Leone is very rich in resources. They've got gold and bauxite and diamonds, iron ore, and it was all being mined while I was there, but by multinational countries and companies, and the resources, for the most part, the economic spin-offs were not coming back to the country, and nobody was being trained to take on the skilled jobs of those resource extraction areas. And I saw development aid efforts. There was a lot of development aid in the country, but I saw some of how it failed, or failed at least villagers in the short term, like setting up palm oil plantations, which perhaps in the longer term would bring in more economic resources, although not to that village. But in the short term, it meant that the swamps where the women grew their vegetables so they could feed their children during the dry season got dug up and removed. And so women lost a source of income to sell vegetables and a source of food for their families. So I guess it was really unpacking that and trying to understand also what role, if any, I could play in trying to address those structural determinants was a big part of my learning.
It's really interesting what you're saying, because you are really depicting, a picture of intersections, really, in what we talk in classes and seminar, and you are like sort of really providing concrete examples. So going to the example of the field and the contributions of women, we talk a lot about One Health, about climate change and its impact for, our practice in global health. And more, I think we need to be more aware of our environment and what it means, if we can't have crops, and who is sort of in the front bench to try and provide for the family economically, and what the very meaning of poverty would sort of highlight a bit of those experiences. Maybe a bit of that chapter in that section specifically, where you sort of refer to heading ribs of poverty.
Yes, I'll just read a paragraph from it and then maybe say a few words. Poverty had to be taken into account in everything we did because it was everywhere and implicated everyone. I began to understand the local experiences of. I'm back. I'm sorry, my internet went down.
It's okay. We were just raving about your the depth of emotions that you share when you are telling your stories. And Professor Batal, who's online, actually is projecting us on a big screen in his lab with his students. So it's very humbling as well. All nerve-wracking.
Well, it's nothing like the internet to go down to make us even more humble, right?
I know. And you were talking about access and about technology and about our privilege, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And we are very dependent of this sort of external privilege. So you were, before you left us, you were finishing to read some parts of your of the segment of your book with respect to poverty and what when you experienced there. And at the same time, I'd like to sort of build on the fact that maybe you want to talk to us about the changes. And when were you there last? What period exactly are you referring to in the book? When were you there last? And what are your sort of appreciation of, we have evolved, I think every single country on this world has changed. Not only COVID-19 has changed us, but way before. And for some people, COVID-19 didn't make a difference. They were already in a situation of vulnerability. So maybe you can sort of build in your reflections on that.
Absolutely. So I was in the country from 1978 to 84, and then I returned once in 1985 to teach at the Faculty College. So it's been many, many years, and the country has been through a great deal. They had a civil war, which lasted for 11 years and didn't end until 2002. The country was then getting back on its feet, making some really steady progress. Health indicators were improving. And then, of course, Ebola hit in 2015. That actually led to deaths of 20% of their workforce in healthcare, if you can imagine that. And there have been other issues since then. I am perhaps most encouraged by some of the changes that are taking place around education. They have a really interesting policy that was adopted just a couple of years ago, and it's called the Radical Inclusion Policy in Education. It's actually worth reading for anybody. It is about how to include not only girls, but those with disability, those who are living in poverty, and so on, and make sure they get the schooling that they need. You can imagine that during the Civil War, schooling was just decimated. So for many people living out of country, there was a whole generation of kids who didn't have the opportunity to go to school, certainly not any schooling that was safe or schools that were consistently open because of the Civil War that was ongoing. There have been changes in policies related to gender, actually because of all the child soldiers. And that's another very sad tale during the Civil War, which was largely males. They passed legislation in 2007 in the country, which meant that children were protected and considered children until the age of 18. And then that's had implications for when females can be initiated in the Bundu society and their choice to be circumcised or not as part of the initiation rites. So things are changing and things are improving, but it's been a slow, tortuous process really in many ways. Maybe if I could just finish reading what I was
just going to ask, yes, please.
Yeah. And then there's a story I'd like to tell about neonatal tetanus, which I think helps to explain the ways in which the situation has and can change, and some of the important features of that.
In terms of what we are, building capacity with our students and what population health means, and when it comes to infectious diseases, that we could potentially prevent, but how to sort of address these issues in a country where resources are so limited, and yet, you sort of exposed to high rates, as you said, of tetanus, especially neonatal and maternal mortality. The human resources are mostly untrained, and yet, they do whatever they can. You mentioned female genital mutilation, which we know from international organization that there is a high prevalence, and yet, health issues are being addressed. So maybe, it'd be nice that you sort of share with us your thoughts on that.
Yes, so, and I will. I think the story will address many of those important issues that you've raised. I'll just finish off the reading here, which is about a disturbing realization that I had when it dawned on me. For the most part, I was working within rather than on the roots of poverty. I wasn't a citizen of the country. I had no direct links to government, either traditional or parliamentary. And CUSO, the organization I was working with at the time, had an unwritten rule for volunteers to be apolitical. Big P, policy advocacy, was out of the question. And I questioned my role as a change agent. So I think that was my dilemma of how do you actually get at structural determinants of health? And can you, when you are working as somebody from another country who is that cultural outsider? So let me tell my story about neonatal tetanus, because in addition to the things that you mentioned, this is really about community ownership and community priority setting and communities self-determining how they want to move ahead. And I think this is an important issue for all of us to consider, whether we're working in Canada and with Indigenous communities or whether we're working globally. So I'm going to tell this as a story, and I've assembled 3 segments in the memoir which lay out the story.
And before you start, I want to tell you that, you have admirers, not only attending, but some of them could not attend, like some colleagues in Toronto who sent me some emails telling me how lucky we are listening to you, and how colleagues who are here say that it's always a delight to hear the way you build those stories. So we're looking forward to your next segment here.
Oh, well, thank you very much. So this is a story about astonishment, despair, and hope. Before I went to Sierra Leone, I expected to see many infectious diseases, and I thought I might see a few cases of tetanus. But tetanus is completely preventable, so I wasn't very concerned about it. When I got to the country, I was absolutely shocked to read the statistics. 25% of all infants died before they reached 28 days of age from neonatal tetanus. I didn't even really know that neonatal tetanus was a thing, but the women knew. There was a word in Mende for tetanus. It was soin soin. I soon came to understand why rates of neonatal tetanus were so high. Most women in the country were delivered by traditional birth attendants. And the TBAs, as I call them, had no formal training for the most part. They had learned their skills through an apprenticeship model, often from an older granny, an auntie, a grandmother, and they were committed women. They were highly respected in the community. They were trusted. They were believed to have the strong heart that was needed to deliver babies. Most deliveries were done in huts on earthen floors. So right away, you can see that there is a risk of contamination with tetanus spores. And there were other reasons too. The midwives traditionally cut the umbilical cord with a bamboo sliver or a used razor blade. Those were stored in the mud wall of the huts. They were not sterilized before use. Hands were rarely washed before they did the delivery, and water was at a premium during the dry season. They also often put hale, which is traditional medicine, on the stump of the umbilical cord to help it heal faster. But that hale included leaves, and it also included bits of charcoal, and the charcoal had been on the ground. So in some ways, it was surprising that rates of neonatal tetanus were not even higher. I was in a village one night. We had started the immunization program, which included tetanus immunizations. It was really dark. It was almost like a slumber party. The mothers were sitting on long wooden benches. Toddlers had their heads in their mothers' laps. Babies were on the backs of the mothers. Our team was setting up the immunization clinic with bush lamps and getting the vaccines ready. It was quiet, very quiet that night, when all of a sudden, out of the darkness, we could hear this woman yelling, soin, 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 soin. And suddenly she emerged. She was running. She was carrying her infant. She ran right over to myself and Paul, who was my senior public health nurse, asking us to do something for her baby. She had already lost a baby to neonatal tetanus. This one had been born 2 weeks before. He'd been healthy. He'd been sucking at her breast, but she knew this disease and she knew it would take him. Couldn't we do something? The only thing we could offer was to take her to the hospital. We didn't know whether to take down the clinic. All these women were waiting for tetanus toxoid to take her in the van, but we had to ask her, and we asked her if she had the permission of her head of household to go to the hospital. Sadly, as she sobbed, she shook her head. No, she did not. That meant that there was no option. This baby was not going to make it through the night. We were just all in a quandary and felt her anguish so deeply. I felt grief and anger and empathy. It was just so hard. We were very quiet as we went back to the hospital that night thinking about that newborn. We continued with immunization clinics, and we were starting to see some changes. Immunization rates were going up. Some of the neonatal tetanus rates were starting to drop, but we had a long way to go to get everyone immunized. We talked about tetanus immunization in every encounter, every meeting with a chief, every visit with a traditional birth attendant, every educational session in the schools, every home visit. It still seems, though, that somehow the tetanus toxoid immunization program belonged to the hospital and did not really belong to the community. We were worried that if for some reason the government withdrew the program, perhaps because of funding problems, the people would not rise up and say, this is an immunization program that we need and we deserve to have it. We continued the work. We were making progress. One day I was teaching in the classroom. I don't even remember what the lesson was. It was so hot that day. We had the louvered windows open. A small breeze was wafting over us. And we heard singing on the other side of the hospital compound. I went to the window and saw that there was a SOE, that's a head TBA. I could tell from her white headscarf. And the initiates, adolescents with long beads around their neck, colorful head ties and lapas, were dancing and singing as they came across the hospital compound, walking towards us. We went out and called Sister Hillary, who was the head of our public health program, because we knew they had an announcement to make. When they reached us, the SOE stepped forward and she said they had come to a big decision in the Bundu Society, the Sacred Society. The local traditional birth attendants had decided that henceforth, every initiation ceremony for the young girls and adolescents would require them to get tetanus toxoid immunization. They had taken control of the program. It was just such a momentous day. We quit the lesson, of course, and we danced with them, shuffle danced around the compound. There was so much to celebrate, and the TBAs were telling us that they were starting to inform their sister traditional birth attendants in other villages that this is what they should do henceforth. So that's my story, and it's probably one of the most exciting days.
It sounds fascinating, especially when we try to sort of put out a protocol, a proposal to be funded, and we sort of decline, indicate very specifically the steps, especially for, how the implementation would work and how we want to involve the community and how, it has to be ownership within the community. Your example is really telling and really loud and clear as to, where the ownership should lie. And maybe in that quick question is access to is an issue, right? So it's really exhilarating to listen to the fact that neonatal tetanus, toxoid should be given, prior to any interventions that would involve babies. How do we so, and we talk a lot about access issues, in many ways. So any thoughts on how we can recommend our students, and colleagues who work on access issues, to build on your experience? What are the lessons learned in terms of public health experiences in Sierra Leone that you sort of bring to Canada also, especially for those who are in situations of vulnerability? Because I think we can announce that we have training, we have in-service training, we have various programs, to help not only the population, but also healthcare providers who are sometimes very limited in their own capacity to attend classes, to attend seminars, to sort of increase their level and their career path. What are the lessons that you want to share in terms of access? How do we encourage that it works, that we have fantastic programs? The implementation seems to me quite a challenge.
Yes, and I think I'll answer it in a few ways. I think, first of all, sometimes in our research protocols, as you have implied, there is an expectation that we're going to lay out all the steps of how things are going to happen. And sometimes that can lock us into steps that actually don't make sense to the community. And it's not the way the community would do it. So we have to be careful, I think, that we don't sort of over-prescribe the way things need to happen. Because even in a Canadian community, I mean, I've never been homeless. I do not have an in-depth understanding of the experience of homelessness, and I never will. I can grow my understanding by people who've had that experience. But really, the solutions, I believe, come from within. And we have to allow and put in place processes that enable those solutions to be brought forward. I think we can help people, explore and examine sort of this prism of determinants and trying to look at different facets of the problem that they may be deeply aware of or not so aware of, a policy that exists at another level of government that they only understand in terms of it's really hard to fill out a form to get access to social security payments. But the problem is in the policy and the way it was formulated. So I think we can help bridge those insights. But I really believe that the solutions need to come from within. And sometimes the solutions are not what we have chosen. They're not the priorities that we think are most important. They may not fit with our nice and neat and tidy evidence-based notion of public health interventions that work. But we have to allow room for these because it's people who know and understand deeply who can find the solutions to access problems and other problems that drive inequities from that experience. So that relates then to the importance of taking time to listen, to really listen, to probe, to try to really understand, to understand a different perspective, to have respect for everybody's lived experience. Everybody has lived experience. How do we get at that? I remember a colleague of mine, Lynn McIntyre, who Bilkis, you'll recall, and she did a lot of work on poverty, very interesting work, both in Canada and globally. And I can remember her talking about
and food security.
And food security, insecurity, absolutely, that was a major focus. And talking about interviewing women who were trying to feed their children on welfare and trying to understand why they chose to give them the food that they did when it didn't look to be very healthy food, but it was calorie-rich food, which filled tummies and made children feel like they were full. She talked about, macaroni and cheese, but using water rather than milk in it, and all these innovations, sadly, that women had to come up with to, make that budget stretch across the months before they got another payment. And certainly with our issues of food security getting worse in Canada now, I think there are many lessons to be learned there. So I think there's a lot of innovation that actually happens when capacities are constrained, when resources are constrained, when challenges are particularly tough. And there are some that I often use as examples. They are not from Sierra Leone, but from other global health initiatives where we have oral rehydration solution, because oral rehydration solution was a solution to cholera victims in Bangladesh in the 1950s, where they did not have enough IVs to go around. And now that's just standard practice. But I'm not sure it would have ever become standard practice in Canada had it not started off in Bangladesh. And kangaroo care is another one that nurses and healthcare workers know very well, that started in Colombia. There weren't enough incubators to go around, so they did skin-to-skin contact, which they call kangaroo care. And that has made its way to higher income countries too. So we need to change our perspective about this, about who has actually got the solutions. And this evidence-based practice, everything, it's part of it, it's important, but sometimes it can sort of put blinders, I think, on us in terms of some of the options and how we really get at mitigating issues around access and structural determinants, as you asked about.
Absolutely. I find it really interesting how you are sort of pulling all these strings together in terms of, who decides what is best practice. And I was reading just earlier some of the public health agencies' recommendations in terms of innovative ways by, First Nations. It's sort of called as being ways tried and true. And so those ways were tried, and those ways have worked, and they're true to the community. So I find that really interesting in the way that, you know, we have to level out what best practice mean. And I just see the message that Patricia is sending around. I would love to hear from it. We have about 9 minutes left, 9 precious minutes. We want to keep you. And I was just wondering if there's anyone, you know, who's attending here. I know some of my colleagues, and I won't point fingers at them, not to make them uncomfortable, but I'm sure there are some, you know, my colleagues who might want to ask some questions and share. They're all sort of pretty much working in global health. And if you have any sort of remarks or even share your, you know, your feelings in what you've heard, that would be really appreciated. I don't know if I can call out on some of my colleagues here to make it more of a...
Tevika has sent a message saying, has a strong defender of community ownership and the notion of solutions from within. I wonder, what do you think is the role of the privileged? Because the disadvantaged might not have resources and capabilities to bring about solutions from within. How the privileged can be both distant and helpful because they keep the power and resources.
Yes, an excellent question, and one that I've asked myself many times. And particularly actually around female circumcision and what is my role as a cultural outsider in that. And I think it is something that the community has to address themselves. But when I look at determinants of health,
have we lost her again? Patricia, is this me or it's about Nancy?
I think Nancy is having issues again. Let's see if she's able to reconnect.
Yeah, she might come back and reconnect. We still have a short 7 minutes that is left, and I think it's a real nice question quand on parle de privilège. Je pense qu'elle en a parlé à quelques reprises de la notion de cultural privilege. Et moi, je me dis dans quel univers on se place quand on veut contribuer à des projets à l'étranger. Ah, elle va sûrement nous revenir. Là, je pense qu'elle s'est débranchée. Au moins, elle va revenir pour venir donner ses petits mots de conclusion et pour pouvoir également nous donner un peu son avis sur la question du privilège. Mais peut-être que la personne qui a posé la question voudrait élaborer un petit peu plus là-dessus. Je ne me rappelle pas qui a écrit dans le chat. Je n'arrive pas à voir mon chat.
Tefik?
Oui, c'est moi. Sorry, I don't know if you hear well.
Oui, on vous entend, mais je pense qu'il y a un bruit de fond de quelqu'un dont le micro n'est pas fermé.
Okay. So my question was...
c'est mieux comme ça. Allez-y, Tofik.
Okay, so my question was about the role of the privileged, because we always think about the disadvantaged, and we build even policies almost always thinking about the oppressed, the disadvantaged, however we call. But we forget the role of the the privileged when they have the power and resources. So I strongly believe that the solutions should come from within, and like self-determination and control should be there. But when they don't have resources, how can they really have control? Because self-determination is not a simple notion.
I agree, and I think that Nancy is going to be back in a minute. I just saw that she's trying to get back, and I agree. There is sort of this midpoint where who defines the nature of privilege, and then if I were to consider that I have privilege, what what and in what ways am I sharing this privilege so that I don't feel like I'm losing, but I don't feel like I am the one who's helping, but rather it's coming from within the partners with whom I'm working. So that there is sort of an ownership from within, as you're mentioning. And, you know, I think we do have to sort of rethink those notions when we write our proposals, when we discuss with partners, and that we put ourselves in the posture of those who are sharing what they need. And you're right, I think, you know, I have a lot of resilience, but I don't have any means to go forward. So I need help from the outsider, from the cultural impostor, supposedly, right? So that's why il y a comme une espèce de passerelle de rencontre qui souvent est peu comprise. So we were trying to, hi Nancy, we still have about 3-4 minutes. We were trying to, Tawfiq here was elaborating on his question about, you know, privilege, and how do we sort of make sure that privilege works? Like, I hold privilege. My assumption is that the other one does not hold privilege, but they do have resilience. Where do we meet so that, you know, we don't feel uncomfortable with the cultural sort of privilege, but we actually work together. So the lessons learned on how we can contribute in global health to support privilege together.
And I think, you know, both have privilege, right? So I may have the privilege of more economic resources and so on, but the privilege in the case of Sierra Leone of being a Mende woman, being a member of the Bundu Society, having the camaraderie and the closeness of family and community and so on, that in itself is a huge strength. It's partly resilience, but I think it's a lot more than that. It is privilege. And maybe if we can sort of rethink privilege, we find that different meeting point that you're talking about that I think is so important. So we can really learn, hear from each other, share experiences, be human together, you know, and surely that is the starting point for a good conversation to find solutions.
Absolutely.
You know, where I've landed, I guess, is that advocating for better and more maternal education is something that I can take on no matter where I'm living, and that's so important as a determinant, as I was saying, to reduce obstetric fistula, to reduce maternal mortality, to reduce female circumcision.
Do you feel like we have only 2 minutes left, even one. I feel like sometimes this conversation brings me back like almost 20 years back, and exact same conversations were kind of happening. We may want to invite you again to sort of, you know, ponder on what have we accomplished. You know, really, if today in 2022, we're chatting about maternal mortality and maternal education and you know, preventable actions that we can put in place to curtail, you know, high rates of certain infections abroad. You know, female genital mutilation remains, you know, a big concern, especially that we have now frontiers that are, you know, not so impermeable, but rather, you know, porous. And so what do we do when we're here in countries where we don't really know how to address this situation? So I think we have lots and lots to discuss, and we might want to invite you again for sure. So Nancy,
I would be pleased to join you. Sometimes it does feel like we're going backwards and sideways and not forward.
Yeah. But I'm not sure where this conversation was so rich, and I think the format was really excellent. You know, we need to talk, we need to listen to your wonderful words. Your book is really inspirational, truly. I'm going to give you the last word, and then I'll say thank you to everyone who was here. So maybe you want to share with us some of the last lines that you'd like to leave us with. It's all yours.
I'll just perhaps read a couple of pieces of advice that I give my former self, my younger self. Learn new truths by listening to others. Feel the depth of human connections. Let these rouse your compassion, your humor, your love, your outrage, and your determination to better the human condition.
Thank you, Professor Edwards. I don't have anything else to add. It was absolutely wonderful to have you over. And again, go on and inspire, older minds, newer minds, and we'll be happy to have you again at the Université de Montréal. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir tout le monde.
Thanks very much, and good luck to everybody who is embarking on their careers in global health.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Au revoir.